Alrighty, so once again, we're here with another video for you guys. So basically, at this point, we've gotten pretty far along, right? And we've really been using mostly things like really just extrude, right, and loop cut, right? Control E, Alt C, those are the quick keys for it. And we've just been using a lot of like move, rotate, and scale, right? W, E, R, and of course our navigation, Alt left, Alt middle mouse button, Alt right mouse button, right? And these are great. And the nice thing is, if you guys ever decide to learn Maya or something like that, you're going to see that it's exactly the same quick keys. And we've just been using some tweak tool as well as our different selection tools right here, circle select, right? I actually adjusted these to some mouse buttons, right? Because if you have an even nicer mouse with multiple buttons besides just three button mouse, you can actually assign things to that too. So if you want to, you can kind of switch some of those around as well. Remember, Q cycles through those, right? And of course, we're in edit mode currently, but of course 4 is object mode, and then 1, 2, and 3 are vertex, edge, and face mode, which are all edit modes. And of course you have those buttons there. So at this point, what I wanted to show you guys was a little bit more of how Blender works, right, for some other stuff. One of the things you can actually do is start to build a little bit of clothing and armor for this character if you wanted to. And there's a couple of things that are good to kind of have on to use to make that easier. So I did want to kind of make a video exploring a little bit of how we can use some of our retopo tools to do stuff. Later on, we're going to actually see retopoing, like later in the year, we're going to see retopologizing for actually rebuilding parts of a character, right? We're going to do like a quadruped, like an animal later on, more complicated than this crab guy. And we'll use that not only to build armor and gear, but also rebuild parts of the character. We're going to get into that much later, though. We're trying to keep this really to some basics. But I wanted to get you guys the exposure to this and get you guys to use it at least for doing some gear and armor. And that way it won't be totally new when we use it later on. Now, one of the easiest ways to start off with retopologizing is to already have some existing geometry. Because one of the weird things about Blender is it has this polybuild tool, which I actually don't even really use for retopologizing. The core tools, if you know how to use them well, are pretty great. I'll also show you guys how to do an add-on. It's called Speed Retopo. It's free. That's great and is pretty awesome at doing retopologizing as well. But by default, it kind of makes you build a polygon from scratch and drag it on there. It's a little weird, right? It's kind of one of the slightly weird things about an overall pretty awesome piece of software in Blender. But like I said, if you've got some great retopo tools kind of available to you already, then or like like speed retopo and some other tricks, don't really have to worry about it. So one of the cool things is I'm going to hit 3 for face mode, right? So 3 for face mode. Remember, it's one of the edit modes. So if you just click edit mode here, which you see the quickies 1, you'll have these 3 options here. Of course, 1 automatically does edit mode and vertex, 2 edge, 3 face. So really get to know those quick keys a lot easier than having to always go to those menus, right? And that's the kind of quick key you'd actually see for those for like Modo. Maya actually has different quick keys for that stuff and a marking menu. Blender can have marking menus for that stuff as well. But I like quick keys for a lot of stuff. I'm more of a quick key person than a pie menu person. So one of the easiest ways to actually get something like this started is to actually, believe it or not, duplicate some polygons. You can actually copy polygons off an existing mesh into their own object, right? Or even copy them off into this object and then separate them. It's actually quite cool. So in this case, I'm in 3 for face mode. And of course, I'm going to go to drag, Q for toggling through, unless you have a quick key already set up for those. Remember, Q is goes to your selection tools and your tweak tool. But keep hitting Q and it toggles through those different options, right? So keep hitting Q and it toggles through this. And so we can get to drag select. You'll notice I've got my radius at 1 so that it's basically just a point instead of a brush. And you just left click drag. Right? So remember, you just hold down left mouse button and it just selects what it touches as you move the cursor. It's a great fast way to do this. In fact, shift, remember add, so I'm just going to add one more there. Control will subtract, right? Shift and control will add and subtract. I just want to select these polygons right here. Now, if we go to face mode, actually I want to see if it's even in this menu. I think it might actually be in the mesh menu, yeah. I just use the control key for it, right? But in the mesh menu, there's something called Control D. Control D, duplicate. And what's really cool is the moment you hit Control D and you click, it's copied those polygons off into their own set of polygons, right? And you can hit W to move those if you want to, and you can move them out a little bit, right? So they're still actually part of this object. You can't really see it here because my capture thing just happens to be right there, and I don't know how to move it, but it's actually part of that one main object right there. So there is this collection right here. This is your objects as a list. These are all part of one object. So you can copy this off and leave it as its own object. You can move it around, make adjustments to it if you need to, right? So we go two for edge mode, and then tweak. I can always just tweak some edges on this guy. There we go. Let's bring it out a little bit. There we go. Now, of course, if you want to turn X-ray on to make it a little easier to see through, you can, right? It's right there. Also, Alt-X is actually the quick key for that. It's a toggle. So if you hit Alt-X, it turns X-ray mode on, which makes it kind of partially transparent, a bit see-through, right? And then it'll turn it off. So it's right there as a button, and there's an excellent quick key already for it. So one of the neat things you'll see is this is actually how you can copy polygons off. A lot of you guys that remember Maya from last year would remember we had to use things like edit mesh, duplicate, and extract. And here, it's just Control D, right? And you can actually keep selecting those polygons, duplicating some more. So I'm going to go back to 3 for face mode, right? And I'm going to select this face. Now, what if I wanted to select this whole thing, right? Now, in face mode, if you double click kind of close to the edge, it'll select the face loop in that direction. So that'll be a pretty easy way to do that. But there is actually in the select menu something called select linked. And there's kind of a bracket key next to enter. And what that does, that actually is your select connected, right? It'll select all the polygons that are directly merged or connected to this. You'll notice that even though this is all one object, right? You can't, it's being blocked right now by this. I'm having to use the Windows game capture stuff. This is being blocked, the objects, but there's really only one object in the scene. There's a camera, which I turn the visibility off. There's a light, which I turn the visibility off. There's this object right here, which is the actual object we're working on. So this is all one object. So when you do Control D, it actually keeps it within the same object, which is actually quite cool. But you do have select linked, right? So if I select this polygon and I go to select linked, you'll notice it selects all the connected polygons to that. So this does have a select connected, and it does have a default quick key, the kind of the right bracket next to enter, kind of a little bit below the backspace. It's kind of over on the right side of your main keyboard, not the number pad. So you do have select linked. In Maya, to be double click on a face, but they kind of use that particularly for face loop selection, which when you're used to, it's actually really cool. So I'm actually pretty happy with the way that those overall quick keys work. I did assign this select link to like Z because it's like closer and more ergonomically sound. Remember, it's something you can totally do, right? Select linked, right click on it, change shortcut, right? So I could change shortcut and say, I want this to be Z, and there it is. And now you see I just hit Z on my keyboard, select linked. So you do have to select the polygon though. The cool thing is, even if you're in edge mode and you hit select linked, it'll do that. And if you hit 3 to go to face mode, it works. So there's actually a bit of more fluidity of how your selection types work here. It's not so fluid as to become weird and obnoxious like MySum can be, but it's actually really neat and quite useful. I've actually found it quite neat. As you get used to Blender more, you're going to start to kind of hopefully love it like I do. I've just really, think it's pretty great now that I've gotten used to some of the things it does uniquely and the fact that it can do a lot of great things from the way Maya did it. So the nice thing is we have new geometry here, and if we wanted to, we could just do extrusions on border edges to create the rest of the armor and gear. It's something we could really do if we wanted to. But we're going to see plenty of that later on. In fact, we're going to build a whole car that way. So for this one, I'm actually going to explore showing you guys how to separate this and use a little bit of retopo tools for this, which actually kind of does use the extrude on border edges anyways, but it does it to the surface, which is kind of cool. So remember, mesh, duplicate, Control D, and whatever polygons you have selected, it'll copy those into their own polygons in that same object. All right. I'm going to hit 3 again for face mode, select the face, and select linked, right? Remember, select menu, select linked. Remember, in the select menu, you actually have more options, more or less we've seen. We know we can double click on edge loops, select linked is great. And And the select loops is actually one called select loop inner region. That's actually really cool also. We're not going to need it quite yet, but that's something very, very neat. You possibly could use it here as well, but just to show you what that does. It does need to work in edge mode though. So if you hit T for edges, and let's say I double click, remember double left click on an edge selects an edge loop. If I go to select loops, select loop inner region, you will see that it actually selects the side of the edge loop that has less polygons, right? So because this side has clearly more polygons, it'll select this side. Very, very cool tool. One of the only pieces of software I've seen that has this is Modo, actually, and Blender, of course. Maya does not have it. So very, very cool. But remember, in the select menu, you do have some kind of select linked and select loop inner region, which I actually have mapped to. I'm going to go to assign shortcut, and I'm going to set it to X. Because I use those a lot, so I figure having them close to Alt and kind of where my left hand is resting naturally, those are great quick keys, right? The more you can have very comfortably kind of on your left side for quick keys, the better, right? And particularly if it's comfortable resting. It's one of the things, one of the reasons I love QWERTY, Alt, because they just make a lot of muscle memory sense. They're all kind of really easy to get to and remember without remembering, right? Whereas the default old non-industry compatible Blender stuff is kind of clunky that way. And there's some things I just changed myself because like select link's way over on the other side of the keyboard. So certain parts of Blender's default quick key set could be better. But that's kind of true of all software. You customize it to what makes more sense. And I feel having stuff very much on the left side of my keyboard that I use a lot, great, right? That's better ergonomics. Easier to do with muscle memory. So just some great little tools that I want to make sure you guys start to see. You don't have to use them, right? If you want, you could easily just, 3 for face mode, grab that face there, up arrow, right? We've already seen that grow and shrink selection. That'll get us there. Remember, that's just grow and shrink, up and down arrows. But that is also in the select menu, right? We'll select more and less. So overall, Blender's got some nice selection tools. And I'm just kind of been drip feeding them to you a little more and more as we go along. We're starting to see drag select a little bit more, which is very useful. And now we know we have select length and select closed borders. You really don't necessarily need to select closed border yet if you don't want to, but select length is going to be quite useful. That does have a default quick key of like right bracket, which is right next to the enter key, kind of a little bit bottom below, kind of the left of the backspace key. So I figured that would hurt for us to see a little bit of, right? Kind of get to know your selection tools a little more as options, as stuff that you can use if you want to, right? You might not need to, but I wanted to make sure to start to get you guys to see this a little more. And just to remind you guys how to assign quick keys, right? Because the more you start to use this and you're using it more often, you're going to start to want to have shortcuts on your keyboard, right? Easier ways to get to stuff than just having to go to the menus. All right, so I'm going to select that, and then I'm going to do select linked, right? So that's just select linked. I've assigned my own quick key, but it's like I said, it's that kind of right bracket key. You'll see it by default in yours, but it's select linked. There is a select shortest path, which is cool also, but we'll kind of, I've already done enough selections for you guys today. But what I want to do is I want to actually get this into its own object, right? When we duplicate it, when we hit Control D, right? That really just made it into its own separate object. Or it's not separate object, but separate polygons. It's still part of the same object as the crab, but it's kind of separated, right? They're not directly merged to each other. They're not directly connected or touching, as you can see. And that's how the select linked works, is it looks for the polygons that are directly continuous with the other polygons next to it. So if you right click, right, because most of the time right click actually has most of the options we need, right? And if you don't see things like these, that's because, remember, I did turn the add-ons on for this one. And as we get to it, I'll talk about that more. But some of the earlier videos, you'll see there's add-ons, right? You just go to Edit, Preferences. There's an add-on section. You just go through and look here, and there's some add-ons I turned on, like, let's see where they at. Some of them are on by default, but Edit Mesh Tools, those are kind of those guys you were seeing there, those options. So keep that in mind, is that Blender comes with many of its own add-ons that are nice and add a little bit of extra functionality to stock Blender. All right, so if you right-click, though, because remember, we're in face mode, right? Right-click, it's the face menu options, right? Face context. When you right-click, brings these up. And you'll see one of the options is separate. And you could separate by material, by loose parts. So in this case, geometry that's just not kind of directly connected. So in this case, we could do that, but if we had multiple and we just want to separate them in their own objects, there's a couple options here. But since I've already got selected, separate selection. And you'll now see, it's harder to see here, but you'll see there's two eyeballs now right here, right? So there's actually two objects in here. Sorry, this thing is in the way. So if I hit 4 for object mode, you will see that these are two separate objects now. And you see how kind of the eyeballs change a little bit there, right? So these are two separate objects now. Now, what's really cool about that is then you can actually do stuff with this guy, right? So one of the things in object mode we could do is we could select it, and we can go to modifier, and you'll notice it's already got its own subdivision modifier on and its own mirror. So that stuff that you apply to the other object will transfer over to this object, which is awesome, which is really cool about Blender. So you don't have to set all those things up again. It's actually on the new object. You already have the mirror modifier set up with clipping. You already have the subdivision surface on there. But we can add another modifier, right? We go to modifier here. We can add another one called shrinkwrap right here. Shrinkwrap. Now I'm going to scroll down because it's kind of got this little red kind of issue error, and that's because it doesn't really have a target object to shrink wrap to. So what we do is, with the shrink wrap modifier on, see the target with the little kind of eyedropper? If I click on that, I can pick the other cube, which is this body, and you notice how it takes this geometry and it sucks it to it. It suctions it to that mesh. So what it does is it's a super easy to use shrink wrap, right? A lot of other software has this, some version of this. Blender's is almost idiot proof, right? It's like really easy to do. You just have to tell it what target object and boom. And what's cool is it makes it so that this stuff sticks to it better. So if I say 2 for object edit edge mode, right? And I've got my tweak tool on, you notice as I move this, it's going to try its best to stick it to the actual surface that's already there. And so this is how we can effectively get some cool kind of modeling going on this, some retopo going on this. One of the things I like to do also is we can go to, so turn right here. So if we go to the little orange guy, right? So that object is currently selected, and there's this little orange guy right above the wrench, right? And this is a lot of new stuff, guys, so this video is definitely one of those things. It's kind of going to be finish up our modeling. I'm not even going to finish up today with this. We're going to still do some more work with this on the next video. But I want to start to get you guys to see this at least a little bit and get you guys kind of exploring copying polygons and all that stuff. So there's definitely a bit more new stuff in this video and the next video. But you'll see this little orange guy right here, right above the blue wrench, has things like viewport display, right? And what you can do is you can check on in front. What that does is it makes it so that it's always kind of showing in front of the mesh that it's kind of behind it. So it's a neat little thing to do for when you're working with retopologizing. It's kind of cool. At a minimum, go to your orange, go to viewport display, and in front. And we'll see a little bit later on how you can go even further with this and do some cool stuff. But we don't need to worry about that right now. This will be good enough for what we're doing at this stage. All right, so little orange guy, viewport display, and this has some cool things that you could turn on for your viewport stuff, like wireframe on the mesh and all that stuff. Kind of neat. You could tell it to display just as wire, so it displays it as a wireframe. So that's kind of where you get some of these cool features that you might want available for this. But for us, just in front, it's going to give us what we need. But it's just like any software. You just have to kind of figure out where all the little stuff's at. But you get a lot of this stuff through here, right? That's where our modifiers are at. That's where we apply the shrink wrap, subdivisional, right? It's right up here at the top. We can add a bunch of these different modifiers. It's right above it. It has things like visibility control options as well as viewport. Kind of some neat stuff there. All right. So in this case, the other thing I like to do just to make sure it's going to stick even better is magnet, right? This magnet up here, and Vlad kind of discovered this, right? If that's on, it's going to snap stuff, and it's going to behave weird, and it's going to look like you're trying to move stuff, and it just tries to jump around. So that magnet usually should be off unless you specifically want to snap stuff. Now you'll notice that that's just turning the snap tools on. Your options for the snap tool are right here. So the magnet, and then this one. And increment actually allows you to do grid snapping. Just turn absolute grid on. You have vertex, right? You have edge. And you'll notice you can actually snap to edges. You can snap to the center of an edge, right? For all of you guys that were used to Maya snapping tools, Blender's like Motos and 3D Studio Max is vastly better, vastly better. Blender's actually got some pretty awesome snapping tools. So not only do you have the ability to snap to edges, but you have the ability to snap to faces. And even within that, they give you options like center, active, and you'll notice you can have it project on self. And I usually have it project on individual elements and turn all these on so that your move, rotate, and scale tools will be follow this. So the magnet turns it off and on, but these right here are options for which one's going to be active. Faces in this case. Project onto self is usually on, but I like to have project individual elements and these guys on. And if you turn snap tool on with face and these guys and these, and then have a shrink wrap on, you're going to have stuff that's going to stick to the surface pretty well, right? It's going to be hard to kind of fully tweak it and move it off. So it takes a couple of little setups, but it's quite easy. It's still quite easy to set up for that stuff. So I'm going to hit 2 for edge mode. So I'm in edge mode again. And I'm going to select just this edge because, believe it or not, your extrude tool can work on edges. One of the differences, though, is that this edge has nothing else connected to it. It's an edge with only one face connected to it. That means it's a border edge, which means you can extrude it. This edge right here, you'll notice, has 2 faces connected to it. That is not a border edge. If you extrude off of this, you're going to create non-manifold geometry, which is a no-no, right? That always kind of can be disastrous, right? It can create weird geometry that many tools won't work with, that won't look right. So if you're ever going to extrude edges, it really should just be border edges, right? Edges where it's at the edge of the surface. There's nothing else. It's at the border, right? Another way to think of it is that it's an edge that's only got one face connected to it. But with that set up, you can actually just use Control-E for extrude, middle mouse button, and you see how it's actually sticking to the surface? And so I can kind of use it here. Now what's really cool is if I hit E for rotate, you notice when I rotate, it does a really good job of having that guy stick. W for move, R for scale, right? And you notice how it's actually doing a pretty good job of keeping these guys sticking there. Control-E for extrusion, E for rotate, W for move. And you'll see that with these face snapping tools on and shrink wrap, you can use your normal modeling tools to actually build some gear and armor on this guy. Of course, I could switch back to my tweak tool, right? And tweak tool, of course, fully works with this as well. And all your selection types work with it, so you can switch back and forth, right? And I'll do another extrusion, bring this guy back, another extrusion, and see the clipping will automatically try to make those weld together pretty well. There we go. And you might need to play with them a little bit more. It can be, oh, my extrude tool is still on, that was why. There we go. Let's go back to here. You can play with it a little bit. But that clipping, you see, is pretty awesome, right? It actually does a good job of, you just keep extruding and it starts to weld those guys back together. And then if we wanted to, we could select 2 faces, Control-E for extrude, right? Control-E for extrude. And there we go, right? And you can actually do some really, really neat stuff with that. So I'm going to switch back to my tweak tool, select vertices, and we're not done with this retopology. I'm going to do some more stuff to it, right? But you'll notice that this allows us to start to kind of put some cool little gear and armor on this guy that sticks to the surface. And you see how we can use extrude in a kind of unique and cool way to kind of make some neat adjustments, right? So very, very cool. And I just want to make sure that you guys really kind of got to see this a lot and start to explore it, right? So that'll be a great place to stop for today. And we'll do some more, and I'll probably rehash some of the things I turned on today. But that'll be a great place to stop, I think.